Good evening from the News Radio, 1120 a.m. and 93.7 FM KPNW studios. I am Jorge McGee. Welcome along. Actually, I'm Bill London. I do the wake-up call, 6 a.m. to 9, Monday through Friday mornings on KPNW, streaming worldwide at kpnw.com. And this news is brought to you by Rick Dancer. Guy. That's right. Rick Dancer sponsors this news because he believes that you deserve to hear more of the news that you generally don't hear because nobody does it. All right, here's a look at some of the stories we're following. So we're going to talk about the Eugene 4J School District, and this goes to a much larger issue, and you'll understand why in a second. So the Eugene 4J School District is doing something that no other K-12 school has done so far, and that is they are joining a lawsuit to block federal guidance that school officials say will destabilize their funding. In short, they are suing to protect DEI initiatives. Now, they argue that the U.S. Department of Education made an unconstitutional threat to cancel federal funding of any education institutions that don't conform to the department's what they call new interpretation of discrimination, which now includes, in their words, well-established diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Now, 4J, along with the American Federation of Teachers, the American Sociological Association, and a number of other plaintiffs, argue that a letter sent by the U.S. Department of Education on February 14th makes an unconstitutional threat to cancel funding at any school that doesn't conform to the department's interpretation of discrimination. Now, Eugene's 4J district is the first public K-12 school district to sign on to the suit and to essentially bring suit against the Trump administration. It was filed on the 25th in the U.S. District Court of Maryland, and according to 4J, federally funded programs feared to be at risk by the federal DOE's revised interpretation of discrimination include those that support programs for students with disability, houseless students, American Indians, and economically disadvantaged students. Okay, so basically, they're trying to defend DEI. So it was a 4-page letter that was sent out by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. And it was sent out on February 14th. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to read some germane parts of it and what it is that 4J is complaining about. Now, on the first page, they say, and like I said, I'm going to read parts of this. In recent years, American educational institutions have discriminated against students on the basis of race, including white and Asian students, many of whom come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They say, for example, colleges, universities, and K-12 schools have routinely used race as a factor in admissions, financial aid, hiring, training, and other institutional programs. They say it is a shameful echo of a darker period in this country's history. Many American schools and universities even encourage segregation by race at graduation ceremonies, in dormitories, and in other facilities. Now, it also reads, educational institutions have toxically indoctrinated students with the false premise that the United States is built upon, and it's in quotation marks, systemic and structural racism. And they've advanced discriminatory policies and practices. Proponents of these discriminatory practices have further attempted to justify them, particularly during the last 4 years, under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, smuggling racial stereotypes and explicit race consciousness into everyday training, programming, and discipline. It reads, but under any banner, discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin is, has been, and will continue to be illegal. Now, it goes on to talk about the Supreme Court decision in 2023 dealing with Harvard University. It was students for fair admissions versus Harvard. And it clarified that the use of racial preferences in college admissions is unlawful, sets forth a framework for evaluating the use of race by state actors and entities covered by Title VI. And the court explained, quote, classifying and assigning students based on their race is lawful only if it satisfies strict scrutiny, which means that any use of race must be narrowly tailored, that is necessary to achieve a compelling interest. Now, according again to the letter, at its core, the test is simple. If an educational institution treats a person of one race differently than it treats another because of the person's race, the educational institution violates the law. And that essentially is what the Eugene 4J School District is arguing as unconstitutional and illegal. They are saying that if the nation's schools don't comply, well, then they're going to cut off their funding. Speaking of funding, here's why we can't have nice things in Oregon. So there is more than one reason that the Oregon Department of Transportation, in particular, and we've covered this story here on Get Real with Rick Dancer, why they need more money. And they have been on the stump lobbying for this, that they need extra money, this legislative system, or essentially the sky is going to fall. Or better yet, the roads will slide off into the ocean. Well, part of the reason they need money is because they can't do math and they can't reconcile a budget. And they want a giant, fat, taxpayer paid for funding package. Now, here's something that is going barely reported in Oregon. This week, the Oregon Department of Transportation made a presentation to the Joint Committee on Transportation in the legislature. And during that presentation, Travis Bauer, who is ODOT's assistant director and the top finance official, told lawmakers how the agency made a more than $1 billion error in their 2023 through 25 budget. And because of it, a January audit of ODOT pegged the actual damage at $1.1 billion out of a $5.9 billion biennial budget. In other words, the agency, expected that they would have 19% more revenue than they actually did. All right, so this is what happened in this legislative session. Brower explained that the model ODOT uses made incorrect assumptions about when ODOT would receive federal funding. And Brower termed the error an overestimation of federal funding in our project delivery and local government budgets by about $1 billion. Now, when you say about $1 billion, normally that means, it's under $1 billion. It was actually over $1 billion by $100 million. That's a lot. Now, the agency discovered the error in 2023, but then they waited to notify the Oregon Transportation Commission, which oversees the agency, until early 2024. And that's when, the OTC said, all right, you need to be audited. In the audit, and this was first reported in the Statesman Journal, which is out of Salem, auditors found that ODOT failed to perform a basic accounting function, reconciling actual revenues to the projected revenues from its budget. In other words, ODOT established a budget based on what it projected it was going to receive, but they didn't take the time of checking whether the money was actually there and arrived. In other words, they overspent. According to the auditor's quote, in developing the agency's budget, the process didn't ensure that a reasonable federal revenue figure was used for the delivery and operations budget. They said an over-reliance on the highway cash flow model and a lack of understanding on how the statewide transportation improvement programming impacts that model drove the budget error. And it's perfect timing. And I really do mean that, because ODOT has been trying to build a case for the last year and a half why it needs major revenue increases on top of what it would normally get in this particular legislative session. And they've focused on the need for all of this extra money because, we haven't gotten money from gas taxes, and, we need other sources to keep pace with all of our requirements for maintenance and completing our major projects. Now, here's Brower's summation of all of this on, basically what is going to be and why the legislature should give them several $billion this session, and on their accounting error. He said, quote, "It was a significant impact and one that we have worked very hard to address." So, if you ever overdraw the checking account, try using that line with your wife. I mean, seriously. One time when we were first married, over 30 years ago, $85. Honestly, I'm surprised that I have all of my limbs. But this is how he describes it. It's one that we've worked hard to address. Good. Now, State Representative Shelley Bosshart Davis, the vice chair of the Joint Transportation Committee, probably had the best quote on the subject out of the meeting. And she said, "A $1 billion budget mistake coupled with a more than 300% increase on the cost of the Abernathy Bridge on I-205 are just two examples of problems that need to be fixed and accounted for before we ask Oregonians for another dollar." This is Oregon. They'll get the money. Speaking of roads, a protest, if you recall, and we reported this here months ago, a protest that blocked traffic on I-5 in Eugene last year prompted one lawmaker to introduce a bill that would allow district attorneys to prosecute protesters as rioters for impeding traffic. It's House Bill 2534, and it seeks to modify the crime of rioting and its tumultuous and violent conduct clause to include the use of any motor vehicle or person's body to impede traffic, create a traffic hazard, or block the normal, reasonable movement of traffic on public roadways and highways. Now, under law, riot is a Class C felony defined as 5 or more people engaging in tumultuous and violent conduct. The Class C felony charge could be a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison or a fine of up to $125,000. Frankly, I don't expect this to make it through the legislature. Oregon lawmakers are busy introducing over 50 proposed Oregon constitutional amendments. That's more than ever before. And any that pass would have to go in front of voters to be enacted in November of 2026. And there's a ton of them. There's a couple, though, in particular, that would have a huge impact. Actually, there's 3 of them that, if they were to pass, would make it much harder. One of them in particular would make it almost impossible for citizens or taxpayers to put initiative petitions up for a vote. Now, Oregon's Democratic leadership has been trying to change this for a long time, and they now have supermajorities, and of course, they're going to sell it as it will stop all of these facetious, which will probably be their words, initiative petitions that make it for the ballot. But none, by the way, of these constitutional amendments have any effect on referendums that are put on the ballot from the legislature, which some opponents have said, well, if you're going to set the bar higher for actual taxpayers and citizens, maybe you need to set the bar a little bit higher for yourself. Another one of them is a right to, and this would be a constitutional right, to a clean, safe, and healthy environment amendment. Now, this one is being pushed by environmental groups, and it would open the door for environmentalists to sue cities, counties, and businesses using climate change. This would open up lawfare in the state and essentially put environmentalists in charge of just about every aspect of the state. Then you have Oregon House Bill 3419. Now, this would have serious consequences for homeowners and farmers who rely on private wells for fresh water. Now, I grew up on an acre out in the country, and we had our own well that we used to irrigate our garden, and of course for the normal things you use water for drinking and doing laundry and so on and so forth. So what this bill would do would be a requirement that private well owners put meters, which they would have to pay for, and get permits. The meters would track usage, which would be followed for a few years by the state. Then the state would cap how much water that you're actually able to use out of your own well based on your average usage and what the state thinks you should be using. Now, this would give the states more control over private wells, your private well, and your groundwater. It will limit how much water homeowners can pump from their own wells. It will open the door for regulations and fees on private well owners. And this is something that Democrats in the Oregon legislature have wanted for a long time. And that is charging people to use their own wells. It would also require, of course, costly meters and permits, and it would result, if you overuse, fines and restrictions if your usage exceeds government-imposed limits. So you're losing your water rights. You'd be restricted from using your own well as you see fit. It would increase your costs. It's also government overreach because that's more control over your private property and your water access. And it also is going to put your property value at risk because restrictions on well water likely are going to reduce your home values. That is House Bill 3419. And we'll end with this. I like this. So you probably didn't know this, but this is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Yes, it is. And I think we need to have a party, maybe give some gifts. I'm sure they're going to open up an aisle of merchandise at Bi-Mart just because of National Invasive Species Week. Anyway, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, this is the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, they are now trying to spread the information about invasive species, and they're going on a PR campaign to let people know that the large invasive rodent, similar to a beaver, known as nutria, are not only not native, that they're invasive, but they want you to know that the South American species that was brought here and was released from captivity in the 40s, that are huge rodents and slightly smaller than a beaver with a rat-like tail, are fully edible. Yes, nutria are edible, and they have started a campaign with its own positioning statement, save a swamp, saute a nutria. And they say, well, these things destroy plants to keep marshes stable, and it leads to erosion and damages wetlands. So eat them. They want you to eat them. Now, the advantage, if you want to do that, is, well, they're not protected. They're not considered game. They're not really even considered wildlife. They're considered an invasive species, meaning that you can kill as many of these things at any time you want to, except, if you live in a city, don't just go opening fire. That's not legal. You don't need a license. You can trap them, you can shoot them, and if you do trap them, they can't be relocated, they have to be killed. And they're saying, hey, go ahead, eat nutria. And the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife helpfully says, if you're going to do traps, bait them with sweet potatoes or carrots, but be careful because when they're trapped, they're aggressive and dangerous. Okay. Yeah, it's nutria. It's the other white meat. It's better than beaver. All right, this look at the news brought to you by Rick Dancer, because he cares. All right, Rick, time for you to roll out the reel.